different room and just see if the audio works on this? I'm going to go through the different things. Can you look at the stream and see if it works? Because I've started the stream now. Or just like go sit somewhere and see if you can hear it. Wait, okay, so I'm going to go to the different scenes, see if you can see. Hello, Professor.
Hey, how are you?
Good, how are you?
You guys had a good fall break. I'm Kyler Joe. I'm the Director of Programs of the American Whig-Cliosophic Society. Joining us tonight, we have two legal titans, Professor Richard Albert and Professor Keith Whittington. They'll be debating the question, is the Constitution broken? Professor Richard Albert will be debating the affirmative, the Constitution is broken. Professor Whittington, the negative, the Constitution is not broken. Pass it on to Sam Kligman, Secretary of our Society, to introduce Professor Albert.
Absolutely, it's great to see you all here. Professor Richard Albert is a William Stamps Farish Professor in Law, Professor of Government, and Director of Constitutional Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Born and raised in Canada, he's the author of more than 20 books, which is pretty incredible, and Director of the International Forum on the Future of Constitutional Studies. I met Professor Albert at the ASU Model Constitutional Convention back in May of 2024 this year. And he spoke right after lunch, so everyone was a little groggy and tired. And he spoke for about 15 minutes, and by the end of his speech, he got a 5-minute standing ovation, which is a tall task right after lunch. He's an incredible speaker, an incredible mind, and an even better gentleman. So we are very fortunate to have him at Whig-Clio today.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Great. We're welcoming back Professor Whittington, who is a David Boies Professor of Law at the Yale Law School. Professor Whittington was appointed to the Presidential Commission of the Supreme Court in 2021, where he investigates the question whether or not the Supreme Court should be reformed. A few months ago, he wrote the book, You Can't Teach That, The Battleground Over University Classrooms, where he challenged groupthink culture and argued that universities should implement better measures to preserve the First Amendment on college campuses. Professor Whittington spent most of his career here at Princeton serving as the Cromwell Professor of Politics from 2006 to 2024. Please welcome back to Princeton, Professor Whittington. Okay, so the debate format goes as follows. Both speakers, starting with Professor Albert, affirmative, will be given a chance to give a 7-minute opening statement. Following that, there will be a 5-minute response speech, and then there will be audience questions for 15 minutes. After that, beginning with Professor Whittington this time, the negative, both speakers will deliver a 3-minute closing statement. With that, best of luck to both speakers. We'll begin with Professor Albert's opening statement.
Well, thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me? We had some difficulties before. Yeah? Good, good. It's a pleasure for me to be here because this is my first time visiting this beautiful campus for academic purposes. I came here for sports-related reasons when I was in college. At Yale. So it's a real honor to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Sam and Kyler. Thank you. And what an honor to share the stage with Professor Whittington, who's one of the brightest and most influential legal minds in our present day. The question for us today is whether the U.S. Constitution is broken. I suppose one might ask the question, why is it even worth debating this question? After all, the United States is the world's most powerful country, maybe most prosperous country. What is there to ask? But if you care about democracy, you might answer the question in the affirmative, that the Constitution is indeed broken. Because when in 2 weeks Americans cast their ballots for president, the person most likely to win is not going to be the person who wins the majority of the popular vote. The person who is most likely to win, according to polls today, is going to win a majority of the Electoral College votes, but not of the national popular vote. And so you might wonder whether this is a proper way for modern constitutional democracy to choose its leaders. The country that Ronald Reagan described as the shining city on a hill, the country that led the global war for democracy over communism. If you believe in democracy, you might also answer the question in the affirmative, because the Constitution appears to violate the cardinal rule of democracy, which is one person, one vote. The Constitution locks in what many regard to be an undemocratic structure of government in the Senate, which is to say that California, with its 40 million residents, has the same number of senators as Wyoming, the country's least populous state. And so one might wonder, as a matter of democracy, is the Constitution broken? If you don't care about democracy, perhaps you care about constitutional rights? Maybe. But then you might ask yourself, does the Constitution protect enough rights? Does it protect the right rights? The Constitution of the United States doesn't protect the modern rights that you see protected in constitutions within the United States, in the states, nor constitutions outside the United States around the world. Rights like the right to health, to a clean environment, to food, to health care, to a job. Instead, the United States Constitution protects the right to bear arms, the Second Amendment. There are not many countries that protect that rights. I can name them on one hand, and they're not protected as robustly as the Second Amendment is. Haiti, Guatemala, Iran, Mexico. Is that the kind of company that the United States wants to keep in terms of the constitutional rights that it protects? So maybe you don't care about democracy, maybe you don't care about constitutional rights, but perhaps you care about the Constitution's capacity to give a sense of belonging and unity to the country. If that's your measure for whether or not a constitution is broken, then perhaps you'll agree on that front that the Constitution is broken, because think of the racist and gendered terms that continue to taint the pages of the US Constitution still today. In the year 2024, you'll read that African Americans count as 3/5 of a whole person. You'll read that if an enslaved person runs away to her freedom, the state requires the return of that person, that thing, according to the moment the Constitution was written, that thing, to her owner. Or perhaps the most vile rule in any constitution that I know of, and I know maybe all of them, a rule that says one cannot disrupt the international slave trade. This is in the Constitution still today. Now, of course, they're no longer law. They're no longer legally valid. But imagine you're a young person, maybe an older person, reading the Constitution, trying to find your place. And you might read this and say, why am I an other? Why is this not written for me? Now, maybe you don't care about democracy. Maybe you don't care about constitutional rights. Maybe you don't care about a feeling of belonging and inclusion. That's fine, because you might say, all of these are flaws that can be fixed, because the US Constitution provides a mechanism by which it can be amended to fix these things that we might not like. Any of the three things I mentioned, or any others that you have in mind for yourselves. And it's true, the US Constitution does provide a route to alter the rules. But that route is blocked because the US Constitution is the world's most difficult to amend. Most difficult to amend. And so you're trapped. You are trapped with a constitution that is unamendable, some believe is undemocratic, that doesn't protect the rights, nor enough rights, and that engenders a sense of exclusion for many people in this community. So the question is the US Constitution broken? I've given you at least 4 reasons to think that it is. Each is a strong reason, and there are many more that we can talk about. But I invite you to look inside and ask yourselves whether this 18th century Constitution that you have is up to the task to address the 21st century problems that confront this country. So thanks again for having me. What a pleasure to be here. Thank you. All right.
So thanks so much. I appreciate the opportunity to be back. One thing that was not mentioned is during my time here on the faculty, I was also on the board of trustees for Whig-Clio for many years, and so it's always nice to be in the building and always nice to be able to support the programming. And I appreciate y'all putting together this particular topic, especially with Professor Albert's participation, because he's not only an expert on thinking about the US Constitution, but comparative constitutional context more broadly. And I think thinking about this from a comparative perspective is an important perspective on thinking about the US Constitution. When we think about how well does the US Constitution work, what does it mean to thinking about alternative constitutional structures, we not only want to be thinking about the context of American politics and what we're familiar with in this own country, we also want to be thinking about what are the alternative constitutional designs we could be choosing from, how are other countries are operating their constitutions, and so what kind of choices could we be making if we were going to replace ours. And one of, I think, important questions of trying to think about whether a constitution is broken more generally is simply trying to think about what's this problem even mean? And so what do we mean if we were to say a constitution's broken? We already saw some kinds of answers about what kind of standards we'd hold up to say, is this a valuable constitution? Is this the right kind of constitution we can imagine adopting? I want to circle back to that in a minute, but I first want to suggest that there are some core functions that we would expect a constitution to serve, and a starting point question in thinking about is the constitution broken is simply to ask, is the Constitution doing the job that we want a Constitution to be doing within a political system more generally? And it's worth at least identifying what those jobs are for a Constitution. And then we can imagine, okay, well, is the US Constitution actually performing those functions particularly well? And if it's not performing those functions particularly well, what are the alternatives that might actually fix them or move us toward better solutions? So I think there are two kinds of issues that we ought to focus on when we're thinking about what kinds of problems constitutions are designed to solve. One is simply the question of, do people live up to the Constitution itself? It's hard to establish a written document that actually controls politics and controls government in general. So one of the hard standards, if you're trying to design a constitution, is not just how do you write a constitution that looks very attractive on paper, but how do you convert that paper constitution into a reality, such that people actually feel like they have to adhere to that Constitution, they're actually constrained by that Constitution. So, for example, they don't like who won the last presidential election, they actually wind up stepping down from office or are pushed out of office rather than thinking, I'll just continue sticking it out because who cares that the Constitution says I have a 4-year term, I should go ahead and stick around for a lifetime term. That would be much more attractive and appealing. So it's an extraordinarily difficult thing to even get a paper constitution into operation and make it an effective governing document. And one feature of the US Constitution is that it is an effective governing document. We have accomplished that. We accomplished that early on. There have been hiccups along the way. Those hiccups are worth talking about and are serious and thinking about the history of American politics. But it's no small thing that we have a constitution that's actually reasonably functional now. It actually does constrain politics in meaningful ways. And we should appreciate that fact and also be cautious about undoing the work that's already been done on that level. A second kind of concern, though, is not just do you have a constitution that's actually efficacious, but is it efficacious in solving the problems that you're trying to solve? That ultimately what constitutions are designed to do is create a functioning government that can actually solve public problems more generally. So is this a constitutional design and is this a constitutional system that accomplishes the things we want our political system to accomplish? This is why we abandoned the Articles of Confederation, the first federal constitution we had, precisely because it was not a functioning constitution in terms of solving the problems we were trying to solve. The United States couldn't pay its debts, it couldn't raise armies, there was concern that the United States couldn't continue as a functioning country that would not be invaded again by its enemies. And so in the face of a constitution that was that ineffective, it became crucial to draft a new constitution that creates better, more powerful structures that are capable of solving the problems that confront the country and allows you to move forward. It's a serious issue now when we look at the current US Constitution and our current political system is our current constitutional system performing the kinds of public functions we would want to perform now? And there's lots of good reasons to think that it's not serving them nearly as well as we would care for. Right? So we are familiar with problems of deep gridlock that make it very difficult to pass public policy that we think might be important to pass. We have extraordinary difficulties actually balancing our budgets on a consistent basis, which was a crucial issue even for the Articles of Confederation. Part of what causes the Articles of Confederation to collapse is precisely the fact that the US government can't pay its bills because it doesn't have a good enough system designed to make that possible. And so you worry that the US Constitution maybe is not doing a good enough job in allowing us to make the public policy we need to make in order to address the social ills that confront us, in order to make the government actually functional more broadly. Those are real problems that we face, although there's lots of good things, I think, about how the political system operates and the constitutional system operates more generally. But even when we think about those problems, we would have to think about, to what degree can we attribute those difficulties or difficulties of governance to the Constitution itself and to the constitutional system as opposed to other problems? This is a familiar debate in the context of American history, thinking about the secession crisis of 1860, for example, where the secession crisis is one of the great failures of the American political system and constitutional system, which spurred historians to then try to think about to what degree is the Constitution the fault that caused us to have the secession crisis? Was this a failure of the Constitution, or was this a failure of the politicians and the society surrounding the Constitution? So it wasn't so much the constitutional features, constitutional structures that caused our problems, but rather the problem was our politicians and our civil society more generally. And I'd suggest likewise our problem now is much less with the structures of the Constitution, the design of the Constitution, than it is with our politicians and the civil society more generally. You layer on the kind of polarized political system that we have now and the kinds of deep divisions we have in our political system, that you can tweak the constitutional design and constitutional structure, and you're still going to have a lot of the same familiar problems about how do you actually make public policy in an effective way, how do you get agreement about how to move forward, how do you pay your bills on a consistent basis and the like. What the Constitution has provided us, and more effectively provided us over time, is a functional democracy. And it's provided us with a free society, and moreover, it's provided us with a prosperous and growing society. And that's not true of many other political systems across the world. And it's no small thing that the US Constitution helped establish the foundations for a kind of political and governing system that allows for those things to flourish. So if the Constitution were to fail to do that, I think we'd have very serious problems. But given that the political system and the social system and economic system we actually operate works reasonably well, I think we all leave the Constitution mostly in place.
Thank you, thank you. So there are different ways of measuring the success of a constitution. You've heard a few. One could be just endurance. How long does the Constitution endure? Well, on that score, the US Constitution is doing pretty well. World's oldest uninterrupted constitution. You might also ask yourself whether the measure of a constitution is whether it promises what you wanted to promise and then delivers on those promises. On that front, I think it's a mixed record. But certainly it's the case that the US itself as a country is a vibrant democracy. It protects a certain number of rights and freedoms, and it allows you to be heard because it allows you to channel your energies, political energies, through a number of institutions. Congress, state legislatures, courts. But there's another measure that I want to raise, another measure by which we might evaluate the success of a constitution. And that is, do other countries look to it to borrow from it? Now, it used to be the case that the United States Constitution was the global model for constitution making. That was perhaps inevitably going to be the case because the US was the first to create a modern constitution. The others came around and said, well, we want one of yours, one of those things. And so they borrowed from the US design. That makes sense. But then there's something that happened after the Second World War, just thereafter. By then, the US was the dominant global constitutional power in terms of the design of the Constitution. Others just copied and pasted. That continued for a number of decades after the Second World War, but it began to decline. Countries started to look elsewhere for guidance in how to create the structures for an effective democracy. And they turned away from the US toward France. The French semi-presidential model is now ascendant since 1989 in the world, for better or worse. But we know for sure, whether you like the French model or not, we know that the US Constitution is not the one that people borrow from. It's just not. Now, there's another point that I think is very important in the time that I have left, which is that you don't have to just take my word for it. Don't just believe what I say that the US is not the constitution you want to have for yourselves if there are other options to choose from. The late Ruth Bader Ginsburg was asked, about 12 years ago, she was on a trip to Egypt. She was interviewed on national Egyptian television, asked the question, Justice Ginsburg, if we want to write a new constitution, should we look to the US as a guide? And she paused for a moment, looked directly at the interviewer and said, no, don't look to us for guidance on how to write a constitution. Look elsewhere. She had two ideas of where to look. It was not the US. South Africa was one. Canada was the other. And so the educated, informed, enlightened view of which constitutions are the ones to borrow from is not the US. I want to make a revelation here, which is that I associate myself with a great American thinker who was not present at the founding of the US Constitution, at the writing of the Constitution, and that's Thomas Jefferson. I don't typically like to associate myself with persons from the founding era, but I associate myself with him on one important point, which is that he believed that every generation should write its own constitution. Every 19 years, 20 years, the people who are governed by the higher law should have a chance to shape and reshape it if they so wish. Now, you don't have that option today because even if you want to amend your constitution, you can't do it. It's too hard to do it. The path is blocked. And you might say, well, we have the convention route. The states themselves can initiate a process by which we amend or replace the Constitution. But that too is blocked because of the difficulty, but also because that route goes through the Congress. And Congress has yet to recognize the validity of any petitions sent to it requesting a constitutional convention.
So I think there are two questions we ought to separate. One is the question we actually asked, which is the Constitution broken, as opposed to the question of could the Constitution be reformed in productive ways. And I think it's clear the Constitution could be reformed and altered in productive ways, and we have certainly examples from other countries of alternative constitutional designs. And moreover, I think there's no question that if we were to write the Constitution, not only write a new Constitution today, but even if we tried to write a new Constitution to replace the US Constitution at any point in American history after 1787, it would have looked different. There would have been different aspects of that Constitution. So for example, as was mentioned, the United States is extremely unusual in having a presidential system. Parliamentary systems arose after the American Constitution was founded, and it's entirely likely that if the United States had been drafting a constitution after the rise of a parliamentary style system, the United States would have adopted a parliamentary system just like many other countries have as well. So there's no question that that kind of reform, there are very basic structural reforms, not to mention lots of other kinds of more modest reforms that some are more standard and basic to the system, as well as reforms that would adapt to fairly idiosyncratic features of the US Constitution, such as the existence of the Electoral College, for example, could easily be adopted in the American context. But that's different than saying, is the Constitution we actually have not functional? Is it actually broken in some deep and fundamental way such that we ought to be desperate to try to change our Constitution and adopt a new one? I have to admit that in the years after the adoption of the South African Constitution, it's hard to look at South Africa and say, there's a model we'd want to follow. That we ought to just scrap the Constitution we have, embrace a new one, and hope for the best, and hope it imagines. I have my own doubts about Canada as well, but I will save casting aspersions on Canada under the circumstances. But no doubt there are things we could borrow from other countries if we wanted to, but it's different to say that there are improvements that could be made on the Constitution as opposed to thinking, is our Constitution so dysfunctional that we have a desperate need to alter a new Constitution? I'm generally a fan of Jefferson, and I associate myself with Jefferson in lots of different contexts, but on his particular notion of rewriting constitutions every 19 years, he was probably mistaken, and James Madison probably had the better of the argument between those two friends. Madison, because he actually had the experience of trying to draft a constitution, responded to Jefferson by saying that the problem with drafting constitutions is it's extraordinarily hard. And we would be better off if we tried to have constitutions that were somewhat stable and would persist over time, rather than thinking we ought to go every generation into trying to make constitutions entirely anew. And I think we have found on the whole that that's probably the better plan. It's a more Burkean response, a slower response, a response that emphasizes muddling through rather than radical change. But muddling through when it comes to constitutions, I think tends to be the safest and best route forward. And certainly given the kind of constitution we actually have and how well it actually functions in practice, we'd be better off muddling through rather than trying to toss it overboard.
Great, we're going to open it up to audience questions now.
We have lost our clock, so we're completely undisciplined at this point. Oh, I can't see it. So I've lost my clock, which is practically the same thing.
Yeah, hi, thank you guys, sorry, not guys. Thank you both so much for coming to speak. I had a question for Professor Whittington. I was just wondering how you can reckon the fact that in multiple instances the Electoral College has led to a president who lost the popular vote but won the presidential election in the end, with the fact that, I guess with your point that the Constitution is not broken.
Well, so partially his question is, I think, whether or not we should regard that as being broken, which I don't particularly. So it doesn't concern me that much that we have this gap between the Electoral College outcome and the popular vote outcome. And one of the reasons why it doesn't bother me that much is because no one's trying to win the popular vote. Everybody's trying to win the Electoral College. So we actually haven't run a campaign in which anyone's actually trying to maximize their popular vote numbers. And we'd have very different looking campaigns, and as a consequence, we have very different outcomes if that's what anyone was actually trying to do. So we have this accidental outcome that says, oh, look, we have this gap between the two, when no one was trying to accomplish that, and no one was trying to avoid that necessarily. They're trying to win the presidency, which means you win under the rule set that you actually have. Having said that, it's not obvious to me that this is a point of deep concern more generally. Now, I don't think we should be, if we were trying to draft the Constitution today, I would not advocate for the Electoral College as the approach we ought to have to write in the presidency in the first place. But it strikes me as a relatively modest set of concerns with the way the current system is designed, and certainly not enough that I would want to willy-nilly tear up the Constitution and change it to something quite different, not least because it creates its own sets of problems and difficulties about how do you redesign that presidential selection system if you were to move away from the Electoral College, which will have some unanticipated consequences of its own.
Professor Albert, you have a chance to respond.
Well, I wanted to respond to something that Professor Whittington said in his second intervention, which is there's a difference between whether the Constitution is broken and whether it can be improved. I think the point that I want to stress is that even if you want to improve your Constitution, you can't do it. That's what makes it broken. You can't do it. And whether you want to improve it in ways that align with conservative ideals or progressive ideals or non-aligned ideals, whatever it is you want to do, it's just beyond your reach today and perhaps for a long, long, long time to come. And so for me, whether a constitution is broken has a lot to do with how we regard a constitution. What is a constitution? For me, a constitution should be a set of higher laws that are a reflection of the views and values of those who are governed by that thing. And I'm quite confident that the Constitution of today does not reflect the modern views and values of most Americans, at least in one way, for each person. And you can't fight for your values and get it reflected in the Constitution because it's a battle that is lost before you've even begun to fight it. Every amendment proposal is dead on arrival before it even begins. So that's the way in which it's broken. Whether or not you believe in the democratic failures of the Constitution, the rights failures of the Constitution, or the belonging failures of the Constitution, that alone should give you cause for concern. That alone should alarm you that your Constitution is frozen. And you might say, well, it's not really frozen because it changes all the time. Yeah, 5 justices can change your Constitution by their interpretation of it. Now, if you want a juristocracy, welcome to the United States. but it's not meant to be a juristocracy.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much, both. I have a question on constitutional replacement. So let's think about the idea that, yes, it's broken and it needs replacement, which is a far-reaching form of constitutional change. Now, thinking about Europe and constitutional endurance, we see that modern constitutions emerged through after World War II, post-fascist constitution making, post-Soviet constitution making, which confirms the theory that there needs to be some form of historical shock or a big societal change or political change of which a new constitution is the product of, right? So, do you think, or do you know from your comparative expertise, of any case where replacement is the product of a mature discussion between constitutional actors, or would we need also in the US for a new constitution to be enforced, a big historical event, let's say, or a big, I don't know, I can't think of anything like that that could happen soon, but how would you see that, the feasibility of it actually? Thank you.
There are three models of constitution making around the world. One is the one you just alluded to, which is the model in which a constitution is replaced after a moment of shock, of crisis. I call this the grenade model of constitutional reform, because you just lob a grenade into the order and then you rebuild it anew. The second model is the more orderly model. It's the hourglass model. You just flip it and you start over. This is the Jeffersonian model that exists in 15 or 16 states in the United States right now. Voters are asked every 10, 12, 15, or 20 years, do you want a new constitution? And they're asked this at the ballot. If they say yes, then you convene a constitutional convention at the state level to rewrite your constitution. If they say no, that's fine. But at least they've had the chance, right, to say, I want a new constitution. You don't even have that chance right now. This model exists also in other countries, not just in US states, but in countries abroad. Micronesia is one example. Palau is another example. Chile followed this model in 2019 to 2023 when they created a process to make a new constitution. Now it failed, but it's not because of the process by which they chose to make a new constitution. It's because of the politics involved. So Professor Whittington is absolutely right when he says that constitutionalism and constitutional activity is not just law, it's politics, maybe 85% politics. I'm now involved as a member of the Constitutional Reform Committee of Jamaica, appointed by the Prime Minister to write a new constitution for the country. I'm the only non-Jamaican on that committee. And it's following a very orderly, non-chaotic process that does not align with the historical model of the grenade model. So it's an hourglass model that we're following in Jamaica. So I think it's possible to rewrite a constitution without it being provoked by an external shock. But even if, imagine today, and I'll take 10 more seconds, imagine today the US Constitution were somehow rewritten. I'd be completely fine if political actors around the table and the people ratifying it said, we just want to keep the same constitution we have. Because at least you would have had a chance to make the affirmative declaration that you're happy with what you have. You can't do that now. You can't do that now.
So I have to just note that for Jefferson, he would have said, of course you can do that now. The Jefferson's model is not, you go through Article 5. Jefferson's model is either through the amendment process or through the rewrite Constitution process and ask Congress's permission. The structure that Jefferson imagines is not, you ask Congress, can we pretty please write a new Constitution? Jefferson's model is the people themselves draft a new Constitution, and you insist on it politically and develop it. And we've had that model pursued in states, where states perform their own constitutional conventions, they draft their own constitutions, they put it to the people for a vote through their own ratification process, and they don't go to the state government and ask permission to do so, and they don't go to the state government to ask for a process to do so, and they don't go through existing constitutional procedures to do so. So if you want a new constitution, you could develop one right now, today. And it doesn't matter how Article 5 is written and the hurdles that creates. Part of the reason why we don't do that is because it's extraordinarily hard. And I can guarantee you that if you tried to do that, it would fail. People would not adopt that Constitution. You'd have an extraordinary time drafting that Constitution. These processes that were embedded in state constitutions, and many state constitutions in the US do have it, where they have a process by which they call periodic constitutional conventions on this Jeffersonian model to say, draft a new Constitution. We stopped doing that precisely because those conventions routinely failed. They were called, they drafted constitutions, they attempted to draft constitutions, they either couldn't succeed in drafting a constitution, or they drafted a constitution, sent it out for ratification vote, and it was voted down by the people. And as a consequence, it's been nearly 100 years since we've had a new constitution drafted successfully in the United States. And I would defy you to imagine that in our current polarized political environment, we could successfully adopt a new constitution or draft a constitution that would be anything near as good as what we have now, and actually imagine that would be put in place. Given the politics of the situation then, the question is not, theoretically, wouldn't it be nice if we could democratically come up with a new constitution? The question is, how do you actually successfully do that? And one reason why you do it in these moments of radical reform is because only when things are so horrible and terrible you convince people they ought to draft a new constitution. Under other circumstances, not so easy to do. And things are not that horrible and terrible right now, fortunately.
The states that have this Jeffersonian model, they still put the question to the voters every so often, every 10 years or 12, 15 or 20. And the people choose to say, no, I don't want a new constitution. And that's fine, because the people then are still being heard. They have the opportunity to say yes or no. And so what I'm suggesting is not that Congress should tell you whether you can or cannot call a convention. You can certainly do it if you're a constitutional entrepreneur. Go ahead and try to do it and muster the support from everyone you need support from to do it. Good luck. I think it'd be pretty hard to do. But the point is that I wish the Constitution had incorporated within it the Jeffersonian model, because then you really would have had access to the Constitution, the possibility to infuse it with your own views and values, modern ones that I think are inconsistent with what we see in the present Constitution today.
So you argued, Mr. Whittington, that some of our political culture issues might be the real cause of problems in modern America. I wanted to ask, is it not possible that those are downstream of our constitutional design? Polarization could be encouraged by the two-party system that naturally arises from the first past the post-electoral system. That's not something we can get around. There's no ability to, work with third parties with the electoral system we have. And so, to what extent do you think, modern political problems are, inherent, or are they caused by the political system that we are operating within?
Yeah, so I think it's certainly a good point, right? The one reason why we have a two-party system is in particular designed the presidential system. The presidential systems encourage the development of a two-party system rather than a multi-party system. I tend to think the differences between these are a little overstated in terms of their actual consequences. At the end of the day, there's a bit of a question about, do you form your coalitions in the form of internal party dynamics, or do you simply create separate parties? And nonetheless, you still have the same underlying fractures and divisions in your society and your political system. It's a question of how those divisions get organized and play themselves out through the political system. It is possible the Constitution contributes some to our current polarized environment. I'm a little skeptical. I think that there's a strong causal consequence there. And part of my skepticism is driven by the fact that most other advanced democracies are having the exact same problem we're having right now with that level of polarization and division. And this seems to be a deeper feature of our current political economy across the globe. Rather than a unique feature of our particular political system. How it plays out is maybe specific to the American system, but European countries are facing very similar problems that we are in terms of underlying social and economic divisions.
I did just want to finish my answer to your question. I said there were three models of constitution making: the grenade model, the hourglass model, and the US stands alone in adopting the sundial model. Time never stops. You have the same constitution. Now, of course, it's possible to change that. And the roots of the possibility of changing your constitution is really in the founding, when you use the grenade model, right? When you just blew everything up. So those are the three models of constitution making. I just want to make sure I finished answering that question.
I was actually wondering what the third one was. I thought maybe I missed it.
I think one more question.
Yeah, let's
right?
take one more question.
Thank you guys for coming. Professor Albert, you mentioned that there was a disproportionate representation of the Senate, you mentioned in California, and I was wondering what you would suggest to be a solution to that, whether that be consolidation of the House, and ratification of the Senate in general, or maybe keeping it as it is now, and also like the socioeconomical, political, geographical diversities that states possess in terms of representation.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So you're asking me to address and defend the Senate. And this is related to the democracy
He's asking you to
argument.
throw it over. You don't have to defend it.
The democracy argument that I laid out about the disproportionate representation that some states have in relation to bigger states. I actually think this is the weakest argument against the United States Constitution being broken. Because imagine if you say, well, let's fix this disproportionate representation among states in the Senate. What do you do? I suppose you can abolish the Senate. But then how are states represented in the Union? I suppose you can say, well, let's just assign senators according to population. But then that's what the House does. So why do you have two separate chambers? You might get something out of it if you stagger elections. So then you might say, well, we want the Senate still with the same kind of representational rule as you have in the House to be elected every 6 years. Every 2 years, you have a third of the body reconstituted. That might still serve a purpose, right? Because you get a greater infusion of popular will every 2 years with some stability of the membership in the Senate. So that might be a way to do it. But I still have a question, though, which is, why is the representational rule the same between the House and the Senate? But I think that's the weakest of the arguments that I've made about why the U.S. Constitution is broken. I think maybe one of the strongest. You'll see it at play in 2 weeks when the president who will be elected, I'm not positive, but I think that's what things are trending like, will not have won the national popular vote. That's certainly not the standard for any democracy to hold high.
I have to admit the Senate makes me more nervous than this, and partially for the same reason the Electoral College could make me nervous. So I don't think it's broken now, but I do worry 20 years from now, 30 years from now, it could be broken, and for this reason. Not because I'm intrinsically offended by the underlying democratic claim about is the wrong person winning elections because the rule set isn't working out right. But fundamentally, if you did have a political system or a country in which population was so radically malapportioned relative to power holding within the political system, such that not only a majority, but huge majorities, for example, can't effectuate their will politically, you've got a real political problem about the durability of that political system. And we've seen this in other countries as well, for example, where their legislatures, and we see it actually in the United States. So a lot of the early state constitutions embedded the apportionment of their legislatures in their constitutional text itself. So you couldn't move it as population changed and developed. So state legislatures were just fixed in time as a consequence of how their constitutions were drafted. Those constitutions were fundamentally broken because as the population moved in those states, then you increasingly had small, tiny elites that were just dominating the entire state, and you couldn't change it without changing the constitution. The result was a lot of states just rewrote their constitutions and abandoned their old constitutions because those constitutions were fundamentally broken. You can't have a system that was that anti-democratic. And you can imagine a world in which the United States at the federal level starts looking like that as well. I don't think we're in that world. I don't think we're close to that world yet. But you can imagine population developing in ways that eventually becomes quite troubling. The challenge, though, and it's the same challenge they face, or it's a part of the challenge that they faced as well, and the challenge a lot of other places face when they deal with these kind of representational problems is, okay, so you have democratic principles where you want the majority to be able to get their way for lots of purposes, but you also have competing interests elsewhere, right? And so part of the founders' concern is this concern about the small states being dominated by the big states, and that may have been overblown in practice, but nonetheless is what they worried about. But you can imagine versions of this as played out all through American history and play out in other places as well. So how much should you worry about rural populations and rural parts of society being overwhelmed by the urban populations and urban interest in society, for example? And that's not just a question about what's the democratic principle, I got the majority, I get to do whatever the heck I want. It's also a question about if you are a farmer and all your political interests are just going to be ignored by the political system as a consequence of the fact that you've designed your system to empower urban areas that couldn't care less about farming interests, in the long term, that's probably a political problem for how your society is going to operate and be designed. So you want to have some competing mechanisms that are going to represent different kinds of interests and sectors in society somewhat more effectively. The Senate's a somewhat awkward way of doing it, but it's one way of doing it. But that can also become ossified and go too far. So like I say, so as a consequence, I don't think we're broken now, but I do worry that you could become broken, depending on how the population develops within this kind of rigid constitutional structure.
Okay, that'll be our last question. Professor Whittington, you have the floor. 3 minutes.
Oh, right, forgot the conclusion. So like I said, I think the good news is that our society and political system and constitutional system operates quite well in general, right? We have a very prosperous society. We have a very free society. We still have a society governed by popular government. And so one ought to look at that and conclude, well, the system's not broken. In some deep sense. Moreover, our constitutional system is actually efficacious in the sense that we actually abide by it. And when it becomes too inconvenient, we tend not to just ignore it and ride roughshod over it. And that's an important accomplishment and something not to be taken lightly. On the other hand, it's also true that there are features of the constitutional system that we wouldn't write the same way today if we were doing it from scratch. There's certainly things we could do that would probably improve on the constitutional system if we wanted to, and if we were to embark on it. And so saying that the Constitution is not broken is not to say, therefore, it couldn't be improved in various ways. One of the ways in which I think it may be closest to broken is precisely the one that we put our finger on the end here, which is the question of how to amend the Constitution and change the Constitution. Do you want your Constitution to be somewhat fixed, but you also want it to be adaptable over time? And there are various ways it can be adaptable. And one way, the preferable way, I think from my perspective, is you want it to be adaptable through the ability of writing new constitutional text that can be democratically deliberated upon and voted on and adopted in order to make changes to the constitutional system as a whole. If you don't have a mechanism that allows for that kind of adaptability, you will find alternative ways of changing your constitutional system in order to allow yourself to move forward. And one way in which we do it is through courts, which is a practical workaround of how difficult it is to amend the Constitution. But courts are not the only way that we wind up doing it. We do it through other mechanisms as well, in which the constitutional rules seem too sticky, too binding, too hard to change. We'll find some way of sort of trying to work around them without actually formally changing them. Unfortunately, though, this is a hard problem to solve and not one that other constitutional systems have solved very well either. So one feature of the Canadian Constitution, for example, is that it gives a tremendous amount of power to the courts, as does the South African Constitution, for example. Just take two random examples of constitutions that are relatively recent design that borrow precisely this feature of the American Constitution. That it creates relatively powerful courts that allow courts to have a lot of flexibility and discretion to make changes over time. So other constitutional systems likewise struggle with this fundamental problem that's intrinsic to constitutional systems of how do you make them fixed enough and firm enough that they will do the governing work you want constitutional systems to do, while also making them flexible enough that they can be modified over time to accomplish the things you want them to accomplish over time. I prefer ours was more flexible, but at least it's flexible enough that it still seems to be pretty functional.
The Constitution of the United States is flexible, but not in the right way. I'm going to end there, but first I want to start on the Senate. Because it is possible, theoretically, to change the representation of states in the Senate. Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution gives you a way to do that. If you want to take away a senator from Wyoming or Rhode Island because it's not very well populated in relation to other big states, you can actually amend the Constitution theoretically to do that. But you need to get the consent of the state from which you're taking away a senator. So that part of the Constitution, if that's the thing that repulses you most, is actually unamendable. because never will Wyoming agree to give its consent to being denied, deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate. Same with Rhode Island, same with any other state. So if that's the thing that really bothers you about the Constitution, you think it's broken because of that, then you're stuck with it unless you're ready to throw the grenade and start from scratch. Now, it's very true, and I think this is a very profound point, that the Constitution is frozen in its text, but it changes all the time. It changes every single day by judicial interpretation, sometimes by congressional statutes, by political practice. Sometimes states have a way of acting in concert that puts pressure on the national political system, forces it to evolve. But that's not the way the Constitution is meant to change in material ways. It's not meant to change in material ways by judicial interpretation. It's not meant to change that way. It's meant to change by formal constitutional amendment. You go through the onerous process in Article 5 to change the text of the Constitution and therefore also the written law of the Constitution. That hasn't happened for now 30 years plus, since 1992. That was the last amendment that this country lived. And in fact, some people don't even count that as a proper amendment because the 27th was proposed by James Madison in 1789 and ratified in 1992, over 200 years later. So some people don't count that. And they go back to 1971, the 26th Amendment as the most recent amendment. What's the math there? 50 years? Half a century since you've amended your Constitution? So if the Constitution is broken, it's because it's unamendable and because it changes in material ways by judicial interpretation through the Supreme Court of the United States. That's now the battleground for constitutional transformation, for constitutional change. You win the presidency, you win the Senate, you do whatever you want. That's not a popular way, by which I mean a people-driven way of amending the Constitution, and the impossibility of amendment is the very reason why the Constitution is broken today.
Please join me in giving our two speakers a round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you all for coming. Pastries in the back. If you'd like to sign in with Josh, thank you all. Have a good evening.
Oh, great, thanks. Let's get a photo. Can we get someone to take a photo for us as we're seated? Would you mind? Yeah.